Good morning. My name is Rachel Shield. I'm the Director of Engagement here at Westminster Presbyterian Church. Thank you for joining us for this week's Adult Education Hour. We've had a bit of a change of plans. Our original speaker is not available, and so we are lucky enough to have Katherine Parent is our artist in residence here at Westminster this year, and she is going to be sharing with us about her latest project, Stories of Swampling, an eco-horror electronic folk show. But no worries for our folks who are not necessarily seeing the theological slant to that particular project. It is rich in theology. It's inspired by Watershed Discipleship, queer and liberation theology, and examines the history of churches and colonialism. So it's a really interesting project. This discussion, I hope, will be interesting to you as well. If you haven't met Kat yet, she is a multimedia artist and group art facilitator with a PhD in history from Luther Seminary. So definitely someone you want to greet and chat with if you have the opportunity. A little announcement about next week. Because our speaker was going to be with us for 2 weeks, we are punting a little bit, and we're asking that you would join our social justice forum, which you can find on our live stream or in the Meisel room next week if you're around for Adult Learning Hour. So thanks for joining us. I hope you enjoy the interview and performance by Kat Parent. Thank you.
Hi.
Hello, Kat Parent.
Hello, Seymour Perspective.
How's it going?
Oh, it's going good. I mean, as good as it can be.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. So glad to be here with you today, talking about your work as an artist, a specific project you're working on, that I also have the distinct pleasure and honor to be working on along with you. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself as an artist and as a person?
For sure. I'm really glad to be here as an artist in residence at Westminster Presbyterian this year. And be sharing this with watchers in the Adult Education Forum. And I'm a multidisciplinary visual artist and musician. And I've been making art since I was tiny, making music, singing a lot of folk songs with my mom and sister and grandma. A lot of music inspired by my Scottish roots, and also the 60s protest folk revival. So grew up with a lot of Pete Seeger, Joan Baez. And then about 10 years ago, I started making my own songs, writing and composing, playing guitar and singing. And I am queer and non-binary. I use they, them, and she, her pronouns. And I also have a seminary PhD in history.
Nice. So speaking of the seminary, how does your theology fit into your art and music?
So I think it's always been an interest of mine, and so it grounds everything I do in a way. When I was a seminary student, I was introduced to a lot of European theologians, Barth and Tillich, and American ones as well. And what I was really most interested in, though, was lived out theology in the context of American empire and colonialism and injustice. And so as I was working on my seminary PhD, I was constantly drawn into conversations with people who were doing really practical activism and theological work outside the academy, sometimes within, but also in the streets and in nature. And so a couple things that really influenced my thinking were relationships with people who are part of the Watershed Discipleship movement, and also queer theologians and pastors and activists. So I ran into Watershed Discipleship literally in a carnival tent. I was at the Wild Goose Festival years ago, which is like a progressive-ish Christian outdoor gathering. And there was a project there called the Carnival De Resistance, which was a bunch of Christian artists, activists, performing poetry that was inspired by the nature and eco-justice images in the Bible. It was a very ambitious, like elaborate show that had 4 parts: earth, air, wind, and fire, or earth, air, water, and fire, sorry. And there was like literal water. They would spray the crowd. There were people on stilts pretending to be trees. There was a lot of fire juggling and fire dancing. And it was all woven together with music and also with poetry by the Detroit activist artist, theologian Jim Parkinson. And it was wonderful. It really spoke to my soul in a way of weaving together elements of the spiritual tradition I grew up with, but pointing to all of the ways that water and land are portrayed as sacred in the Bible, and also places where we encounter God. And through that crowd of people, I also met Ched Myers, who's an activist theologian from California. And he was the one who coined the term Watershed Discipleship in 2010, and has worked on those ideas with a bunch of other theologians and activists. And basically, it's about 3 things. The first is to become disciples of our watersheds. So to follow our local water and ecosystems as a way of following Jesus. A second is to let our watersheds be our teachers. Again, the way Jesus is portrayed as a teacher in the Bible and prophets, seeing land and water and plants and our connection to ecology as our like sacred teacher that can show us God. And then third, a pun, which I love, which is to be living in and recognizing the watershed moment that is our current ecological crisis. So climate chaos, climate change, pollution, and seeing that as central to what it means to be a Christian right now in America. So I eventually became part of the Carnival. It was a traveling show for a few years, and it came to Minneapolis and performed in the backyard of the church where I was an artist in residence. And I got to make music with them, be a stilt walking figure from the book of Revelation. And another thing that movement gave me was the concept of the holy fool. So there's a tradition found in a lot of different cultures, but speaking to the ones I have roots in, there's this idea that wisdom is not always found in the people who are deemed most wise. Like wisdom is found in jesters and tricksters. And so a great example of that in European Christian tradition is St. Francis, who is sometimes called God's fool, who was this rich young nobleman who gave away all his possessions, went to live with the birds and the animals, and would preach to birds, all these wonderful stories about this person who was like quite foolish in the eyes of the society of his day, but also embodied this godly wisdom that was calling people into a different way of living. And the Carnival and Ched and many other theologians that I have friendships and activists I have relationships to are living out a long tradition of anti-imperial, anti-capitalist Christian activism in the US. So connecting to people like Dorothy Day and the Catholic Worker Movement, William Stringfellow, the anti-war activist priest Daniel Berrigan, and I think it was one thing to read those books in seminary, and it was a really powerful, life-transforming thing to actually participate in conversations and then do things like be in the Carnival and like literally be camping in the woods for a week with people from all these different parts of the country, talking about the challenges we were facing, the injustices we were seeing and experiencing, but also like where we found joy and where we found the sacred. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, that's really beautiful. I wonder if you can talk about how that looked, how that holy fool, or you talked a bit about, the Watershed Discipleship and how that translated through these, theatrical community experiences. How did that play out with the holy fool concept, and what did that look like, and what does it look like for you?
Yeah, great question. So I think there's a tendency when, like I, as a white academic person, am talking about really serious things that are heavy and big, to be very serious. And the Holy Fool tradition reminds me that play is also a powerful way to communicate, and also art is a really powerful way for people to process heavy things as communities. So with the carnival, that looked like spectacle. It looked like exaggerated embodiments of the concepts we were talking about. I made a screen print for our carnival, a performance in Minneapolis, and there are a bunch of humanoid stilt walking tree figures in it. Mm-hmm. And that was part of a song where the trees were cursing Babylon and calling God to end the oppression of the earth and of nature. And
you could say, end the oppression.
Lord of the Rings pun for the win. Yeah. So part of it looked like literally having jesters open the show. As people would come to the carnival tent for the outdoor performance, they would be greeted by all these strange characters who were inviting them to consider the world we live in differently.
And that happened through specific ways. There were specific characters that would wander around. There were particular experiences in the midway.
Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken, could you tell us about that?
So, for example, I was a celestial janitor. I was someone whose job was to polish the grass and paint the stars, and I was inviting people into deep wonder about tiny, small, and seemingly insignificant things. And Tevin and Jay, the sort of parents of the carnival, are a dancer and percussionist, had done a lot of study of carnival traditions in different parts of the world, and how there's this deeply subversive, also interestingly theological, often very connected to indigeneity and older traditions, event process where one day a year it was okay to make fun of the king, it was okay to poke at rich people, it was okay to be a trickster and jokester. So a lot of the characters we developed as a crew for the carnival drew on those older traditions of carnival. Yeah.
Cool, very cool. Awesome. And then how do these concepts play out in your personal work as an artist and the current projects you're working on? So
after I was part of the carnival, I finished my PhD in history, and I studied the role of Lutherans and churches in colonialism and racism in Minnesota. That felt really important to me to understand better as a white Christian and person who often works with churches who are doing racial justice work. And for me, theology always has a context, and knowing the deeper roots of how a church building was built, what land, whose land it's on, knowing like where a particular theologian came from and how they lived their life, and where always feels like it informs what theology is about and what it means and how it can speak to us. So I finished that. It was very heavy and very academic, and I felt left with this just huge sense of grief and sort of overwhelming sense of like, there's so much that needs to be repaired. Like living on land that my ancestors claimed through genocide, and in ecosystems that both my settler ancestors and our current systems like deeply wounded and continue to be hurting. And I started making art that was really inspired by the indigenous-led anti-pipeline movements and Watershed Discipleship, that was like my way of letting my watershed be my teacher and writing sacred songs and music about what I was learning from that. And around the same time as I was starting to write this music, I also came out as queer and have slowly been seeing myself more and more as a non-binary person. And that, as well as all this eco-justice and racial justice learning, really shook up my faith identity, made me ask a lot of new questions, and also faced me with like personal grief and transformation and loss, because I was, coming out as a queer person, and there were people who I had been close to before in church communities that didn't affirm queerness, that saw it as something sinful or something monstrous or bad. So I started writing a lot about that grief, and remembering this Holy Fool tradition, and remembering that art can be a way to process things that are almost too hard to say, or a way of reaching people who maybe intellectually don't want to listen to me. And that developed into this project, Swampling, which is a Cedar Commission project through the Cedar Cultural Center. And I'll be performing it this February 19th at the Cedar. And that project is also a pun. Swampling is inspired by this classic 80s comic book masterpiece, Swamp Thing by Alan Moore, which centers around a character who was a human scientist who was murdered, and as he was dying, his consciousness was absorbed by the local swamp, and he became this plant elemental who could psychically communicate with all the plants of the earth. And there's part of the series that don't age super well, some sexism and racism and funky stuff, but the existential themes about like, what does it mean to belong as a human when you've been transformed and resurrected into something very strange? And what does it mean to like deeply belong in ecosystems in a new way through that resurrection? That I think really spoke to me, both as someone who's trying to get to know and love my watershed better, and also as a queer person who is both willingly and unwillingly being transformed in my connections. Like there's this profound sense of both alienation from communities that no longer accept me, and also like newfound belonging with queer chosen family and community, and a newfound belonging in myself, being able to accept and like embrace who I am on a deeper level.
I was gonna ask if you could tell us more about the queerness of this character or this world or this environment where the project Swampling takes place, as well as how your theology plays into that queerness, as well as this project?
Sweet. Yes. So I think you could argue that in a way, Swampling is like canonically queer, even though it's not something that's explicitly talked about in the story, because he is a humanoid plant elemental who has a really beautiful romance with a human character. And the way they connect is really different than the way they would have connected if they were both humans in a cis-het relationship. They connect through like ecstatic experiences of plant consciousness. And it's really beautiful and really spoke to me as someone who like finds a lot of sacredness through my senses as an artist. And I think in my writing, I've taken it further into imagining, so Swamplings, just what if a bunch of us were little, like, transformed, resurrected swamp beings living in this new connection to our human and more than human ecosystems, and queering it even more, and thinking about how, like as a non-binary person, there is this sense of transformation and like being in between, and then also a lot of queer thinkers have talked about how important horror and monster movies and fiction are to them, because for a really long time that was one of the only ways that queerness was represented in pop culture. And of course that has like a really painful, violent history of like being demonized and being made to feel like a monster. But also it's something that a lot of people have reclaimed and like found ways to see themselves in. And Swamp Thing is awesome because he is such a beautiful, gentle monster. Like he is scary to humans who have never seen him before and don't know what they're seeing and are anxious, but he just wants to live in the swamp with his love and like grow orchids and like make sure no one dumps radioactive waste.
And communicate with the green.
Communicate with the green.
And he's very powerful as well.
Yes.
And he's very powerful in the context and in relationship with the green and with his surroundings, with nature, really throughout the earth, right?
Yeah. So I think for me, exploring that monster metaphor is about seeing myself as part of creation, which is also a really powerful way of reclaiming in a queer theological sense, because one of the things that Christian theology has often done to queer people in the last century in this country is to say that being queer is unnatural and thus like against creation or against God. And for me, it's so important to understand myself as part of creation, as part of like the vast mystery and ecological diversity of all the different ways that like just humans were created by God. And nature is super queer. Like, there's so many different ways to be a tree or be a fungus, and to reproduce and to experience life. So
doing things differently, strangely, queerly,
yes,
is very natural.
Yes. So that is simple but huge in terms of what I'm exploring. And also another theological thing that's been really important to me in this music writing project has been embracing darkness as beautiful and good. There's a lot of Black theologians who recently publicly have been asking white Christians to consider how themes of darkness as evil and light as good are facets of white supremacy culture within Christian churches. And as a songwriter, I started thinking about that a lot. And I think sometimes in Christian churches, the conversation gets stuck on like, what should we not say? But for me as an artist, there's this whole beautiful creative prompt in it of what can I say? Like, how can I celebrate shadows? How can I explore the sacredness of darkness in my work in a lot of different ways? And that also connected really well with the inspiration of Swampling, because he's the creature of the night, and he lives in the deepest, darkest part of the bayou, and
he lives in the funk.
He lives in the funk.
Rhyme and the grit.
Yes.
And is very pure in his way.
He's so beautiful. So like seeing that dark beauty in myself, and also there's a lot of like disability metaphors in Swamp Thing and other monster media as well. Again, a complicated paradoxical reclamation of something that's often been used to harm people with disabilities. But like, I often am pretty light sensitive, and so identifying with a superhero who thrives best like under the shadow of the trees is really cool.
Beautiful, beautiful. So we're going to get a real treat, a delight in hearing a song the first time it's been shared outside of our home studio. A song called Slow. Do you want to tell us about that and what that's all about?
Yeah. So Swampling, the music project, will eventually be an album, and it has a number of different themes. There's a theme of death. So the main character who becomes a swampling is a researcher who is like hired to make a company look good and be like, oh, they're not polluting. And they decide to tell the truth instead, and they get axed, like literally, and end up in the swamp, end up becoming a swamp monster, like Swamp Thing. And then there's also a theme of like resurrection, transformation, like disorientation of, wow, suddenly I belong in this new way, like I've lost my old body, but I've become this new thing. What does this mean? Which to me speaks a lot also to like internal processes of dismantling oppression and like finding out what it feels like to live in new ways and connect with other people in new ways. And then there's some songs that are just like sheer joy about the beauty of being connected to ecosystems. And then the one we're going to hear is a very slow song of resistance.
Tell us about that slowness. Why you say that with a grin, with that twinkle in the eye of a holy fool. Tell us about that slow resistance.
So I've been thinking a lot about how there's so much urgent in the world that needs to change. Like urgent need to end oppression, ecological destruction, like it's killing what sustains us. And then I'm like but a wee swampling, like I'm one person in connection with a lot of other people also who have really limited power. And a lot of the things that need doing, in my opinion, are things that take a really long time. So like to use local ecology as a metaphor, because I've been studying that for this project as a way of doing my Watershed Discipleship work. Up until the 1950s, the US government really encouraged settlers to destroy wetlands out of this belief that wetlands were dirty and gross and unproductive and full of disease. And farmland was like pure and good and productive. And then in the later half of the 20th century, a lot of settler scientists realized what indigenous people had known all along, which is that we need wetlands. They are vital parts of the watershed. They help restore water to our aquifers. They are filter systems. They're full of all this biological diversity that's really important. And we can't live without them. So for the past decades, like since the 1980s, the US has had an official federal policy that we don't want to lose any more wetlands. We shouldn't be destroying them. Of course, people still do and find ways around that. And it takes a really long time to rebuild a wetland that's been destroyed.
They really exist in their own time and space.
Yeah, so southwestern Minnesota once was, like, huge parts of it were marshland, and most of that has now been destroyed. And a lot of northern Minnesota has peat bogs, which are incredibly slow ecosystems. Like, there are trees in some of these bogs, tamarack and black spruce, that have been growing for 100 years and look like little tiny baby trees. So I found a lot of inspiration in that as someone who sees urgent need for change in systems that affect me and people I love, but also knows that like planting a tree and helping it grow could take my whole life. And holding that paradox together. So that's what Slow is inspired by, is the very urgent but very slow work of decomposers in a peat bog.
And how decomposition is essential to life.
Yeah.
And to growth. And that the main point isn't just to have more and to keep, progressing in that way, but that it can be slow and beautiful, and a lot has to be broken down and reused to grow into something else, right?
Yeah, exactly. Seeing that as not something to be feared or rejected, but to embrace. And finding, it inspires me to try to find ways to live that out in my life as well. Also, like, as a queer person facing discrimination and queerphobic violence, as like a white person trying to dismantle white supremacy, as like someone who just is seeing the urgency of all these things, but feeling my smallness, it does really help me to think of ecological connection as a metaphor, but also like a literal thing in terms of like how I can participate in change. Like, not alone, like one termite isn't gonna decompose a tree.
Yeah, it's no one being's, one variable's responsibility to decompose or to grow.
Yeah, so I think about it as a sacred process that I don't always see reflected in church, but I do feel like deeply reflected in Christian community and in the Bible, of like, ooh, perfect timing.
Cool. Should we get into this song?
Yeah, let's do it. Let me see if there's anything else I should say.
Cool.
I think that's good. That's probably a good amount of time.
Well, thank you for this rich, enlightening conversation. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you for being here and interviewing me. And just to say a little bit about Seymour before we wrap up. Seymour is my collaborator and partner. They are a hip-hop artist and producer. Is there anything else you want to say about yourself?
Sure. I'm a visual artist and a poet, an educator, cultural organizer. Yeah.
And Swampling.
And a swampling, indeed.
Yes. And we've been collaborating for about going on 5 years now, and really finding a lot of cool resonance between my like folk and protest roots and Adam's
folk and protest roots. under different language,
Yes.
which would be that of hip hop.
Yes. And I've been really inspired by just the like endless creativity and recycling in hip hop, which I think also lends itself really well to the swamp imagery. In terms of like hip hop is an art form created by people experiencing oppression, created in scarcity, and turning that into abundance through all these different processes using drum machines and sampling and beatboxing
And whatever we can get our hands on.
yeah, exactly. So learning about hip hop through Adam and comparing it to some of my own understanding of the history of folk music, and especially folk music that's been used in social movements, has been really cool because it's just such an important creative, life-giving force in the world that has also often been demonized by white-dominated media and culture as something bad, when it is, in fact, like a really deeply life-giving and healing thing for so many people around the world and so many movements. So it's an honor to collaborate, and I'm excited to share what we've been working on.
Yes, likewise. Awesome. Shall we get into it?
Let's do it.
Cool.
your back, let me run, let us dream. No quick salvation, extractions hasten, pipelines to nowhere, the road to repair is slow, urgently we wait. Some call us dead weight. This is the long game, chewing up huge pain is slow. Hush, hush, your disgust. Listen, breathe, fear not us. We are the keepers of the night. We are the ones who bring back life. Ash, decay,